So maybe just start off by saying your name and spelling it for us so that we have it correct.
Okay, I'm Jerod Nickles, J-E-R-R-O-D. Nickles is N-I-C-K-E-L-S.
Okay. Jerod, you've been at Grand Valley for 25, 26 years?
Yes, since 1985.
1985. And particularly working in the bookstore, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, particularly for both students and faculty, when you first started, students and faculty that would identify themselves as part of the LGBT community. What was sort of the climate like for students and faculty at that point in terms of, you know, how public they could be about their identities, or whether or not there was any clear discriminatory practices or double standards about, you know, how students or faculty were treated?
Well, I don't think a lot of people did identify as gay, lesbian, transgendered in 1985. I think people were largely closeted. I think in a lot of ways Grand Valley, at least in the 80s, sort of reflected a more conservative local view of things. And the student population that was coming was largely from conservative areas in West Michigan. And so there were not many people who were out, actively out. Even people who maybe had been out at some point earlier, prior to my arriving, there was an emergence of, there were a number of lesbian faculty who were fairly active, I think, in the 70s. And a lot of those folks had either left or gone underground just because of some of the backlash at that point.
And what do you think, I mean, because you're coming in right after when James and Thomas Jefferson has sort of dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
So how much role did that play in that? But also, if there are any other kind of backlash, you know, identifiable backlash, what were those?
You know, I don't know the politics of those schools. When I came, it was Grand Valley State College already in '85, or colleges, and shortly afterwards, no, I'm sorry. It was Grand Valley State College already. It had emerged from Grand Valley State Colleges, and then within a couple of years, it became Grand Valley State University, when all the schools in the state basically decided they were universities instead of colleges. So there was a name change, clearly, and a stationary change. In terms of the politics of that change, I wasn't very involved in that. But I do know that it was a very, well, to me, it felt like a very conservative time. And I myself was closeted at the time. I was married, I had 2 kids, was working through my own issues, and so when I arrived on campus, I wasn't any more out than anybody else, and didn't start to emerge really until a few years later.
Right, right. Well, when did you start noticing a shift in terms of attitude, you know, openness, where people felt a little safer to, you know, self-identify? When did you start to see that?
Well, I think it came slowly, and I think it came first with an initiative to help students, which was Allies and Advocates. And Gloria Tate, who was an associate director of housing, had been to a number of national conventions for housing organizations, and there was seen to be a need to support students in housing, both against bias and hate crimes, and also just to help them emerge to be authentic human beings, to come out. And so Gloria got a few of us together, and it was a very few in that initial meeting. I think there were 3 or 4 of us maybe, who got together to talk about forming an organization that would support students, and really not even actively out programming, but just by virtue of hanging a sign on a door, maybe training people to be more sensitive, to be able to listen to students who had concerns, and to be there. And so it was really Gloria's initiative, and it kind of grew from there. And it was interesting, it grew fairly quickly. A lot of people jumped on board. And I think there were some of us who were closeted at the time, who sort of used that organization as sort of a jumping off point to become more comfortable.
What year was that?
The organization started around 1995. And I actually did not come out until '96 myself. So for me, even going to those initial meetings of Allies and Advocates felt very tense. It felt like, well, I'm exposing myself by virtue of going to this organization. And yet, there were straight people involved too. And so I felt it was a good way to sort of explore and talk. And found a lot of supportive people in that group. Some of the early conversations were difficult. There was some clashing of opinions, different ways of approaching the organization. Some people wanted more active programming, a more political voice. Other people just wanted to be there to support students. So,
What was this in terms of the relationship with the first kind of effort to get same-sex partner benefits at one campus? What's the timing in terms of the school forming and that happening?
the benefits conversation didn't come till a few years later. Really, we were just almost learning to crawl, not even walk, with allies and advocates. And I think at just about the same time, 10% of You, which was the first gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender student organization, was founded. And so the students were at the same time beginning to find their voice. That was in '95 as well. And the real discussion about benefits did not occur until there was a women's climate study in '94, the first women's climate study, and that raised a number of issues about equal treatment of folks. And that at that time, the issue was just including an equal opportunity statement, equal employment opportunity statement, to include sexual orientation in '94. So that was the most that anybody really thought about. And that at that point, partner benefits had not even really come out. In '95, President Lubbers established a task force to try to resolve some of the issues that came out in the '94 Women's Climate Study. And eventually, from that conversation in '95, that task force, partner benefits began to emerge as an issue. And it was still very, very early in that process. A couple of years later then, the president, I think, was getting to a point where he thought it was politically feasible to offer benefits. It was released to the press a little bit early, and it was therefore any opportunity was sort of rescinded at that point. So there was also a discussion about an anti-harassment policy, and there was wording included in the harassment policy based on sexual orientation, and it was sort of an informal decision to do that by our affirmative action officer at the time. And that decision was later deleted by the institution because it hadn't been formally approved by the Board of Control. So it was really a very slow process. There was a lot of informal networking going on with the president at that point, who was a pretty open-minded person and was willing to explore the issues with folks and wanted justice, I think. But it was just a slow political process in terms of being acceptable, to the board and to the community. So
some of the other people we've been talking to about this, the larger issue of brought up sort of the importance of intersectionality around this. I'm just sort of wondering from your time at Grand Valley, how much did entities like the Multiple Affairs Office or the Women's Studies Center, how much did they what role did they play in sort of helping to either support or even kind of solidify the need for more resources and support for LGBT students?
well, I think in the early Multicultural Center, the leader of that office was very much into particularly African American rights, and that was sort of his focus. I don't think that gay issues came onto his radar at all. And in fact, I think there may have been some, perhaps hostility is too strong a word, but certainly an antipathy towards LGBT issues. And so there was not a lot of support. Women's Center came a bit later. It was an initiative that came out of, I can't remember if it was the second or third Women's Climate Study. And that department, that office has been very, very supportive of LGBT issues. But the early support was lukewarm from some of the organizations, I think, or departments that one might perceive would be more supportive. And I think that was just basically a sign of the times. No one was willing to make that political commitment towards sort of that last bastion of rights, which was in my mind, LGBT issues. So,
Would the university sort of formally, as a matter of policy, issue a statement, take a public position saying that we affirm, we support, we acknowledge LGBT students and faculty? Was there kind of a point in history that you can recall when there was sort of like a formal, like, as a campus, yeah, we're going to be proactive on this?
I guess it depends on what you mean by support. There were departments that supported early. The Faculty Senate issued a report in 2003 that supported domestic partner benefits. At that time, President Mark Murray was on board, and he was very much opposed to the idea of partner benefits at Grand Valley. I think there was some movement under his term to try to build respect, to try to ensure safety in the LGBT community, to make sure that people were treated fairly. But that word fair, of course, is open to interpretation. And for many of us, his perspective didn't seem fair. And yet he really wanted to be sure that Grand Valley was a safe and welcoming place for everyone. Of course, people feel more welcomed when they feel they're being treated equally, and partner benefits were a big piece of that. So that discussion really did not start to occur, and it began to occur through some conversations that were very much among a few faculty members. I guess we formed a group early on called the Faculty Staff Association to sort of respond to the first wave when benefits were turned down, to issue a statement to the press, essentially. And then a bit later, that organization was more formalized, and there was a steering committee in that group, and they began to talk to board members and sort of do some canvassing to try to build support for the idea of partner benefits. And I think that really happened as a function of some of that canvassing.
I'm aware that there have been, acts of intimidation, harassment, bullying taking place on campus over the years. Sometimes those kinds of events can be, galvanizing opportunities for people to become better organized, to be more proactive. In your assessment, how did the university sort of respond, as an institution, respond when those things happened, when it became known, either because people held, a vigil of some sorts or held a forum to kind of try to discuss those issues? I mean, how do you think the university responded in general when those incidents have occurred on campus?
I guess I would have to say, I think that a lot of the changes occurred as a function of the climate study. And people I think a lot of things occurred that were never reported. There was no formal reporting structure. People didn't know where to go if somebody mistreated them. And often I think maybe students would leave rather than continue to endure harassment. I know there was an incident where students were spat upon who were holding hands. I think there was a fair amount of name calling and other slights like that. I think some of those complaints came out in the climate studies, and then the university felt the need to respond to the climate studies. And so a more formal structure was created for reporting bias incidents. A lot of times I think these incidents occurred quietly and we didn't have a formal network throughout the university to kind of share that so-and-so got spat upon or so-and-so got beat up. And so a lot of us didn't know some of these things were going on. And if you were in a position like I was of some authority and respect, I didn't endure a lot of that. I wasn't a student, so I wasn't at a place where that occurred to me. But a lot of people, I think, did struggle, and I think probably a number of people left because it just wasn't a welcoming environment. But over time, then a structure was put in place for reporting, and there were places people could go to talk and to support. The student organization was there. Allies and Advocates was there. There was some sensitivity training done on the part of housing personnel to try to assist with that. Multicultural assistants were formulated along the way so that they could be there to help train others. And so I think there's been a consciousness raising that's occurred. You know, as I look back, it seems like we've just come miles and miles and miles. Some people would still say we have a long way to go, but I think we've come a very long way, and certainly the students of today take a different approach than those of even a few years ago. So.
Well, and then eventually, then, my understanding is correct, come forward, and if there were others, the state, in terms of creating that LGBT Research Center, that was sort of maybe another manifestation of the evolution of what was happening on campus. So I wonder if you could just sort of talk about that a little bit, about when that happened, and who was involved, and sort of how that came about.
Milt was involved. Milt and I came out about the same time. He recently said he thought I was the first man who came out on campus, but I think actually it was pretty simultaneous. And we were both coming out of long-term marriages. And I remember having lunch at the time, and we were both sort of shaking and nervous and scared. Because we were leaving people we cared about and marriages that felt secure. But we were also emerging into new ground where there wasn't a lot of institutional support for us, and we weren't quite sure how people would react. But, coming out a little older in life has its advantages too. You're a little more secure in yourself and your position, and I think Milt, having been at Grand Valley for so long, it just became his mission to be there to support students, and he was so patient. He was like water over rocks, I think, for years, sort of just making appointments to talk to President Lubbers and then President Murray, and just trying to change their positions and help them see other viewpoints. And I think that little by little, Milt just made it apparent of the need. And I think the climate studies supported that. And so that eventually he was able to get an office and put in a few hours. He was full-time faculty, but he was a full-time person also in the Office of LGBT Issues, which was in the Dean of Students' office. So he had a part-time office or a part-time position. And just little by little began to kind of work at things and talk to people. And I just really admired his patience, because where some of us got so impatient and angry, Milt just stayed so consistent in his message. And
what's the time frame?
Let's see, the liaison position started in about fall of 2006. So it's fairly late, it's not that far back. And then Milt, it's 2005. His office was established as LGBT Resources. And and then he eventually managed to get a graduate assistant to help with some programming. And then Lavender graduation, the first one, occurred about that time. Advisory group he established in 2006. And then finally the Resource Center opened in 2008. No, 2008. So, it really hasn't been that long that some of this has evolved. Yeah, it's really fairly recent. And if you think about all the things that went beforehand, there were a lot of people having a lot of conversations. I just watched the series on Stonewall on PBS, and actually I bought the tape because you begin to see just how many people have gone before us to make what we do possible. And I think that even the folks who were speaking up in the 70s, it has to become understood that LGBT folks are just like everybody else, with the same aspirations and drives and desires, and want to just be treated fairly and equally. And so I think a lot of people just carried that message, forward constantly, and eventually it has taken. I don't know what it would be like to work somewhere else, but I've always been treated fairly and respectfully at Grand Valley. And
What do you think that has meant for students, and faculty for that matter, and staff, that, since the LGBT Center was opened in 2008, what, how important do you think that is, and is there any like noticeable benefits, particularly for students, that to have that kind of an institutionalized resource on campus?
sometimes you walk into that center and it is just a booming place. I mean, it's just full of people. And I know there are students who walk in there on their very first day, it's like a breath of fresh air. They might be coming from a small community, a rural community, where there's been no support or outlet other than what they might get online. And to be able to walk into a center where they're, fully embraced and accepted for who they are, they can begin that journey then to develop as authentic human beings, as authentic adults, to accept who they are and to find support wherever they end up. And I think it's critical. I also think it's critical that so many faculty and staff have come out at Grand Valley and been active. I think we probably have one of the more active LGBT associations in the state. And part of that might be a function of the fact that we are in conservative West Michigan, and we felt the need to organize. There are other schools that are bigger who don't seem to need that quite as much.
I was going to ask if